Hi, thank you for having me. Um, Dr. Friedman mentioned the sort of two logical fallacies, and I want to dig into one of them in a little bit more detail, or maybe it's a third, I'm not quite sure. Um, but I want to start with this question. Big thing that we, have been talking about for a long time, and what is ostensibly the reason that the United States entered into the wars on terrorism, is terrorism, right? And what is it? One of the absolutely most shocking realizations to me in conducting this research is that there is not an agreed upon definition of terrorism. US government departments use different definitions, like up to 20, and some of them conflict. There are at least 250 separate definitions of terrorism floating around in academia. The UN doesn't have a definition of terrorism. It has tried to ratify a couple times a definition, but has been unsuccessful. So most people in the UN are using a working definition from the League of Nations. There's a lot of conversation right now, in particular, about terrorism and terrorists and what we should be doing about domestic extremists or domestic terrorists. And I think it's really important that we understand that when people use that word, they frequently don't mean the same thing. Colloquially, I understand terrorism as something that targets civilians. So not military, not government, but civilians. But not all definitions require this, including the new and quite circular, I would say, definition put forth by the Department of Defense earlier this summer. I think the most useful way to understand terrorism is as a tactic. It's a tactic of political violence where a symbolic target is used to inspire a psychological response among an audience. It's inherently communicative, right? It aims to send a message. But understanding that terrorism is a tactic requires us to recognize that there's a difference between the terrorist act and the terrorist group or the person who commits that act. Groups and people that use terrorism can and do switch to nonviolence or to other tactics, and other organizations can begin using it. Because terrorism is so poorly defined, the label of terrorist is frequently used to discredit political enemies and to basically authorize the use of state violence against them. I am extremely wary, for instance, of attempts to label the Capitol rioters as terrorists, because doing so, frankly, justifies turning the entire apparatus of the war on terror, which has been violent and unsuccessful, inward toward US citizens further. Something that Bush sort of pointed at in his speech last week on the anniversary of 9/11. Following, the September 11th attacks, his administration had adopted the war paradigm as their primary framework for their response. And it was quickly absorbed by news and other media, even though it was actually quite a departure from international and domestic political norms. In the past, terrorism had been treated mostly as a political problem and prosecuted through the criminal justice system. Also, legally, the attacks of 9/11 did not constitute warfare. War metaphor really doesn't fit with the problem of terrorism. You can't go to war on a tactic. Doesn't make any sense. Wars are theoretically zero-sum. There's a winner and a loser. There's us, there's an enemy, right? There's not room for negotiation, and there's not room for providing aid to quote-unquote enemy communities, right? You also have the problem of blowback. When people's homes are invaded, when people witness occupation, when people witness violence, when people are repressed, they tend to want to fight back. And so when we do sort of military action against people, it actually sort of bolsters the support of terrorist groups. The question is, what are our alternatives, right? Before 9/11, as I mentioned, the criminal justice or policing approach to terrorism was dominant, both in the United States and internationally. After all, most acts of terrorism, bombing, kidnapping, hijacking, those are already crimes, and they can be prosecuted through the criminal courts. so long as the people writ large believe the courts to be more or less just. This approach, a policing approach, has been responsible for the demise of an estimated 40% of terrorist groups historically. A great example of this is the elimination of the Aum Shinrikyo, the doomsday cult in Japan. In 1995, members of the cult released sarin gas in the Tokyo subway, and 12 people were killed, 5,000 people were injured, and there was great concern that terrorist groups had access to chemical warfare. We'll see this concern repeated later. Following the attacks, Japanese police and intelligence officials began aggressively pursuing and arresting those involved. And by 2 years later, in 97, they'd pretty much been eradicated. The remaining members of the cult changed its name to Aleph and ceased terrorist activity. Most frequently, when terrorist groups end, they do so through entry into the political sphere. This feels really counterintuitive for those of us who are raised on the "we don't negotiate with terrorists" kind of vibe. Actually, about 43% of terrorist groups that end do so when they become a political party, right? This is because groups can abandon the practice of terrorism if they believe that their goals can be met in a different way, in a more peaceful way, potentially. It's a lot more feasible to do this, by the way, when a group has relatively moderate or narrow goals. So a group like, for instance, the Islamic State that wants to dismantle a number of different countries and build a caliphate, probably not going to be able to achieve those goals through the political sphere. It's unlikely that they would make that decision because it doesn't make any sense for their goals, right? But famously, this was the path that the IRA took, right? It was subsumed under Sinn Féin, its political wing, became a political party. In such cases, conflict resolution and negotiation can be really powerful tools for ending terrorism, or for ending terrorist violence, at least. But to me, the most promising remedy to violent extremism is building a world in which people are able to address their concerns and meet their needs without resorting to violent tactics. So-called long-term counterterrorism models focused on eliminating terrorism at its root causes by providing people with access to needed resources and equitable social distribution. Equitable social conditions. Unequal land distribution, poor environmental management, extraction of local resources are all strong motivators for the development of movements globally, and that includes extremist movements. In summary, David asked what the 3 most important things to know about the 9/11 terrorist attacks are, and the 3 most important things going forward. And I think for me, they're the flip of each other. 1, I think it's important to be really wary when someone uses the word terrorist or terrorism, because the definition is so vague, but the implications are so strong, right? The implications are this person or this group should have violence done to them by the state. They're not deserving of the same protocols of justice that other people might be. Basically, it's saying, I think it's okay for the government to kill these people. That's really dangerous. Secondly, warfare and militarism have proven to be largely ineffective against terrorism and have sown enormous violence, instability, and tragedy. It doesn't work. And third, I think we can head terrorism off at the pass if we create a world that is more just and more equal.